Hi, everybody. Welcome to the book chat of the UC Davis Humanities Institute, actually to our last book chat of this year. My name is Jamie Fisher, and I'm the director of the UC Davis Humanities Institute. Our topic today will be Witness to Age of Revolution, the Odyssey of Juan Bautista Tupac Amaru by Charles Chuck Walker of the UC Davis History Department. Before I begin, we take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we are gathered here at Davis. For thousands of years, this land has been the home of the Putwin people. Today, there are three federally recognized Putwin tribes: Cachel-Dihi Band of Wintun Indians of the Calusa Indian Community, the Quetzal-Dihi Wintun Nation, and the Yocha-Dihi Wintun Nation. The Putwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. Also, before we get going, I just want to send a couple of special thank yous. First to Kathy Wallerstein, and especially to Gina Nunez for her help and all of her assistance over these years with the book chat. Our format today will be that after my introduction of Professor Walker, I'll invite him to show us some slides, actually, a first for the book chat, because he's got some really lovely art in this new book. And then I'll ask a few questions, kind of framing questions, I think, and then we'll transition to open questions from the audience. If you would, please use the Zoom webinar Q&A function so that questions don't end up lost in the chat. The UC Davis Humanities Institute is the leading advocate for the humanities and arts on campus. As part of our mission, we sponsor research and teaching at all levels of the university and organize a number of public events throughout the year. The book chat is one of those marquee events for these public efforts. It showcases outcomes of a key function of the university, namely to produce groundbreaking knowledge and book publications based on them. An excellent example is the book we're discussing today, Witness to Age of Revolution, the Odyssey of Juan Bautista Tupac Amaru, published by Oxford University Press in its graphic history series, and it's drawn by Liz Clarke. It's written by Charles Walker, Chuck Walker, who's professor of history and director of the Hemispheric Institute on the Americas at UC Davis. He also directs the Global Centers for Latin America and the Caribbean. In addition to Witness to the Age of Revolution that we'll be discussing today, his books include The Tupac Amaru Rebellion, named one of the best books of the year by the Financial Times, and also the recipient of the Hundley Prize from the Pacific Coast branch of the American Historical Association. Shaky Colonialism, the 1746 earthquake tsunami in Lima, Peru, and its long aftermath. Then Smoldering Ashes, Cusco, and the transition from colony to republic, and all of these were translated into Spanish. His translations include Alberto Flores Galindo's Buscando un Inca, In Search of an Inca, and Jose Carlos Aguero's The Surrendered Reflections of the Sun of the Shining Path. In 2020-2021, he oversaw a museum exhibit on Tupac Amaru in Michela Bastidas at Peru's Memory Museum, LUM. He currently leads a project funded by the UCLA Modern Endangered Archive Project to digitalize the Confederación Campesina Peruana archive. In addition to this impressive lineup, he has some additional recent good news. This book, Witness to the Age of Revolution, recently won the American Association of Publishers' Best Nonfiction Graphic History Award. So congratulations again, Professor Walker, on this great book and this well-deserved prize. It's not surprising at all to me, I think, after having read the book, that it has already won such an important award, as I think it's an achievement on a whole bunch of levels. We asked you to bring some slides today, actually. We often invite our authors to read a little bit from their books to give us a kind of flavor of the writing and the approach. But of course, your book is exceptional in many ways, including that it has a lot of fantastic art in its graphic representation of the story of Juan Bautista Tupac Amaru. And so we asked you to bring some slides along, which I think you did, and then maybe you could describe and maybe read a little bit from the text as well that goes along with those slides.
Great. Well, thanks, Jamie. I want to thank the DHI very much. I know these events, Zoom requires a lot of work, so I want to thank you, and I want to thank the people who are spending their, what probably for most is a late afternoon to discuss this book. So we were joking earlier, I have tried to unlearn.
Forget
Zoom
as quickly as you could.
Exactly. Yeah. So I just pulled it up, of course, and now it's. So let me just. Is that working?
There it goes. It's starting. Yeah. Maybe presenter view or view slideshow.
Now my Zoom is updated. I'm not finding that. Is that visible?
It should be in the right in the pull downs of the PowerPoint software.
Oh, I'm sorry. So where is it? Just
hit view, I think. See
Yeah.
view on the pull down menu.
right. And so it's presenter view, right?
Yeah, that's probably best if you have.
Okay, great.
Oh, no, for some reason that's showing us. So I guess just go show slideshow.
Okay.
Maybe escape and then.
Yeah, let me get out of here. I wasn't kidding.
You're really proving your point.
Yeah, exactly. It's usually not this bad. So presenter view or no?
I would just do regular probably slideshow.
Yeah. Okay, great. Okay. Is that working? Yeah,
there you go. Looks good.
Okay, great. So yeah, let me just talk about some of the challenges and satisfactions about doing this. And again, it's hard to talk about a book when people haven't seen it. And we're not at a bookstore where I'm sort of hoping to lure you into going to buy a copy. This is a character who is the half brother of Tupac Amaru, a well-known rebel of the 18th century, maybe Peru's most famous historic figure that I wrote a book about 8 years ago. And the half brother is an amazing story. He was in prison, and basically the map you see, his story took him from highland Cusco, the beautiful former capital of the Incas, to Lima, then in chains around the Horn to Brazil, to Cádiz, Spain, to Ceuta, Northern Africa, where he was in prison for over 30 years. And then he, at almost 80 years old, was freed 1820 and ended up in Buenos Aires, Argentina, never making it back to Peru. So one of the reasons that inspired me to do a graphic history comic, and words I'll use interchangeably, is it's just so visual. Just the cities, the places are so incredible. And we'll probably talk about this, Jamie, but this was a project. If people are saying, oh, this sounds easy, it's a bunch of pictures, I don't have to work, I'm tired of my dissertation, my book. It's not at all. I have never, ever underestimated a project in terms of how much work it was. It was really fun work. But let me just talk about some of these challenges. Unfortunately, Liz Clarke is South African, so it's very hard. The timing, she could not be here today. But one of the first elements is historians and people in the humanities in general. There are people specialized in material culture, sort of a theoretical way. But as historians, and I know I have a few colleagues here, these are things that Andres Resendez, who I believe is listening, we shared many stories, he helped me a great deal, is I had to let Liz Clarke let what everything look like. So I literally was writing, looking up books, going to get coffee table books, a variety of books in the Shields Library, and then talking to friends about what kind of shoes did the Swiss Guard wear in 1810. These are questions I never thought I'd be asking. What kind of rope did the boats have? Almost every element. Liz was a genius, just brilliant. She'd never been to the Andes. Her first renditions just didn't look at all. They were very tropical green. So I sent her like 5 pictures from some of the great Peruvian Andean photographers, and she got it really quickly. So she was a very, very quick learner, but these are some of the issues we had to address. I put this up here of the boat where Juan Bautista's wife, some of his family are being taken basically in exile to Spain up because I was warned, and Oxford warned me very carefully, maritime history, you've got to get your boat right. There are people whose joy in life, I assume many retired Navy, is you've got the wrong kind of core, there's too many cannons, things like that. And this was not a field I know, but I'll admit, even in areas that aren't mine, it was kind of fun learning about this and depending on a lot of people. That's why, as usual, my thank you, my acknowledgements are really long. So this is, one of the elements. Just I had to let Liz know what did things look like. She could do her own. She would try. She would look up what the flags were, things like that. Then one of the questions is, Micaela Bastidas is the wife of Tupac Amaru, the sister-in-law, if you will, of the main character here. So I start with the rebellion, which in Peru is just this major moment, beginning of the Wars of Independence, perhaps, this huge Andean uprising, which ended with 100,000 dead. And there's a great deal of controversy about what Micaela Bastidas looked like. This is one of the things I covered in the museum exhibit that you kindly mentioned before. She has, in the 20th century by states, been whitened and cast as almost like an Andean Barbie, this very white, long-necked, very thin woman, and nothing indicates that was the case. And in fact, some of the records indicate, it's still up in the air, if you will, or it's ambivalent, that she might have had Afro-Peruvian blood, her grandfather or perhaps even father. So we played around with this image, and I think and the book will be out in Spanish in a couple of months. or 3 months. This will be interesting how people say, because this is not the Michaela Bastidas that school kids learned about in school. And it would be the equivalent of, George Washington suddenly having dark hair or a beard or something like that. I mean, it's a bad equivalency. So we darkened her, if you will. And this is just one of the things that we went back and forth about. The other element about representation is Juan Bautista, the main figure, doesn't speak a lot in the book. He gives orders and things like that. I was very uncomfortable speaking in his name. And these are, broader questions maybe we can get into about cultural appropriation, but I have, and I could talk about that more. We have his memoirs, curiously, which is really one of the key sort of mysteries of the book, but we don't have dialogue, how he spoke. His first language was Quechua, and he undoubtedly spoke with a Quechua accent. I was not going to replicate this because it's often used in very racist tropes in Peru. It's just racist discourse, ridiculing people of indigenous or Andean descent. So there's not a lot of dialogue. This page actually has a few words in Quechua, the indigenous language, and my wife Sola Mendoza, who teaches Quechua at UC Davis, was able to help me with the consultation of friends in Cusco. So these issues of representation are very important. I've already found out one of the figures I'll talk about, Duran Martel, a priest who becomes his very dearest friend and savior. School children have a very different view of him. There's an image that's been perpetuated that's not the one that I put. I actually didn't know about that image, and I think it's wrong anyway. So these are some of the sort of deeper intellectual issues or even ethical issues that you have to confront. There's a great the great challenge of writing graphic history is it's sort of like playing a sport. If you're right-handed, you have to go left-handed, because historians and others in humanities, we lead with words. We instruct. We do this in our classes. We do this in our books. We spin a narrative. We tell a story, and we fill in the blanks. If I need to explain the French Revolution in my book on Tupac Amaru or something, I have a paragraph about it. And the biggest mistake made, and what the people, my consultants and aides, like, don't do that. Lead with the images. When you turn a page, you don't want them going to the caption and reading. You want them to see this ship that's about to seize up. So this is when we design the script. It's a process I can describe or not. We'll see if we have time, and it might interest people, it might not. This is what you have to think. What is the visuals going to be on the page? But what Liz was brilliant at is helping me here, making sure that the images told a story, and then breaking it up in very creative ways. I mean, the old days of cartoons being, rectangles, the use of color is brilliant, and these sort of things. So this was my first real one of the first challenges. The other element is, again, is minimize words, but use background. This is an example. These are people who died on the ship on the trip from Lima around the Horn to Rio, and most of these were prisoners died. And I had this in a paragraph, and Liz Clarke brilliantly put this in the background instead. She did this quite a bit. She did this with timelines. You'll see. I had I'm as an historian, I'm very conscious about assumed knowledge. I think one of the ways academic historians, we turn people off is by, well, you all know about the Renaissance. Well, not every reader does, or all of you listening today know about the Tupac Amaru Rebellion. Of course you don't. So the timeline I had, sort of where this fit in, because we'll talk about the age of revolution, to the Haitian Revolution, French Revolution, and she brilliantly put it on a wall rather than having this sort of didactic, rectangle, almost a preachy element here. But you can see, Liz's work, her ability to, it's very dramatic, comics. One very dour academic friend of mine said it seemed a little exaggerated. The colors were so bright. And I said, it's supposed to be visual. It's supposed to be overdone, etc. But she's just, my hat off to her talent and her patience with me. The other element she did really, really brilliantly is getting primary documents in there. I spent a lot of time working on trying to track on Juan Bautista's story, because he's, as I mentioned, he was over 30 years in jail in Ceuta, northern Africa, right across from Gibraltar. And I was fortunate in the Archivo de Indias in Spain, with one of the colonial archives, or key colonial archives for Spanish America, the key archive. I found bits and pieces about him. I had the help of a friend, Luis Miguel Glavi, and others who would be doing their own work and say, oh my God, I think I've got him. So we, incorporated primary documents in the book itself. And then as you can see on the right, this is one, him listed of where he lived. So this is another element that we worked really hard to get these documents in there to give it the flavor. I've asked, the book has been used in courses quite a bit so far. And when I've asked professors, how did this go? Did students like it? They say it's classic. The students who sort of like history more, and there was actually used in a high school class as well, but in college class, who like history, the ones who read the sidebar anyway, love it. Wow, look at this. Look at how he spelled the name, or this is how they wrote the letters. And other students are like, let's move on. Let's get to the story. Let's get to the end of this. But I think in general, we incorporated them really, really well. Jamie, I think I should have told a bit more about his story, but what about if we, can we stop there? And
yeah, no, I usually, I ask a few kind of general questions. One is that, we're a research institute, so we're usually curious to hear how you came to the project, because I think some of our audience wants to hear how scholars get going on these projects that then manifest themselves so fruitfully.
Yeah, this was, Juan Bautista, when I finished the Tupac Amaru book, I felt like, well, this is it. I've always been I've always worked in Peruvian history for a series of reasons. Am I visible? I'm getting a text that I'm okay.
I can see you.
Okay, great.
I hear you. Yeah.
Okay, great. This was one of those stories that lingered. It's in my book in 2 pages, but a page and a half, this curious after story on page 197. And so I said, I want to do something with it. And it was so visual. And when I found this series in Oxford, and they've done a number of just great books, I loved it. And it was a sort of a long, funny story. I approached the editor. She was very interested. The editor changed. She never got the message to the following editor. And then 3 years later, I got one of these emails just coldly, like, responding to your email of January 30th. But it was January 30th of 3 years ago. And that's how we got going on it. I should mention my colleague, Ari Kelman, who did a brilliant graphic history of the Civil War that really inspired me. And so I just thought it could perhaps reach different audiences, something that we're all seeking to do. I thought it'd be a really interesting challenge, and the story was so rich, I really wanted to tell it. So that's basically it.
Yeah, one of the things I really appreciated about it, besides just the beauty of the edition and the drawings and the combination of text with the drawings, which I think works super well, and maybe we'll come back to that because it's so unusual, I think, for our book series and probably for the university in general. But one of the things I really appreciated was the way that, as the title indicates, you're kind of intervening in a kind of common understanding of the age of revolutions. Right. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see this weighing in, because one might assume that a book like this isn't really making a scholarly contribution. It's sort of illustrating things, but I think you really are, because you're helping us rethink what the age of revolutions was.
Yeah, and thank you. I've been really glad. A lot of readers, I think some readers have sort of missed these or been overlooked, but a bunch have reached out to me, and I think there's sort of 2 levels. The broader one is the age of revolution. The title calls him the witness to the age of revolution. And what I say is that he was part of this massive uprising in the Andes that, a bit like we used to say about the Haitian Revolution, has been written out of world history. It deserves a larger place, the Tupac Amaru Rebellion, something I've been preaching for 20 years now. And then he is taken to this area in Ceuta, where he witnesses as a prisoner and learns about all these uprisings. He sees Trafalgar. Some of the battles are right in front of him. Ceuta is a presidio, but he was not in prison per se. He wasn't in a cell. He was allowed to walk around this very restricted, but 2 mile by 8 mile. And he made friends. He talked about it. So what we learned from bits and pieces about him is, what do prisoners do? They gossip, they learn about news, and they were saying, and his arc is incredible, because it's late 1780s. French Revolution, the consolidation of the United States, all the changes and the wars among France, English, in Britain. And he brings this up in his memoirs, which he writes at the very end of his life, about how he talks about the Enlightenment and how he had lost hope, but there were hopes, there were signs of light coming out of France in the Americas. So, you know, I haven't, academic reviews are just starting to come out. They've been pretty positive so far, but no one's really confronted. I mean, no one said to me, he's not a witness of, you know, he's not going to, this is not going to replace my book on the French Revolution. But I think that argument's there. The other argument is about him personally, which I also think has sort of larger repercussions. He is, and I cover this in the long essay about him, is a 25-page essay or so, you know, right after the comic. And this is what I think some people logically stop and others, you know, read it very carefully. He has been cast as that his memoirs were apocryphal, that he didn't exist, that there was no brother Juan Bautista Tupac Amaru, and that he shouldn't be taken seriously. There's a long story. I won't even try to summarize it. It goes back to an Italian thinker, 1830s, De Angelis, who becomes very important in Argentina, and then conservative Argentine writers sort of re-examine him and say, nah, he didn't exist. This is fake. There was no brother. And I think this has a lot to do about, can an indigenous person write his memoirs? One of the criticisms, or one of the doubts, better word, is that, well, he didn't know how to write very well. How could he write these great memoirs? And so what I track in the book and what I discuss in the essay is he learned to write with this dear friend, this priest, political prisoner, Duran Martel, Marco, who's himself an incredible character. They were together, they lived together, presumably learned to read and write. Plus he was, for the last, really from since 1800 till 1820, he was writing pretty constant letters to asking for pardons and things like that. And these were sort of drafts of these memoirs. So I think there's a larger argument about memory and things like that, memory and who writes history, who writes their own stories.
And if we could take maybe a step back to the beginning of this incredible tale, really, how did his Odyssey begin? And maybe you could review a little bit of the geography, because maybe some of our audience,
absolutely.
Because the geography of it, it's completely engaging, and I think reflects this fascinating time in kind of Spanish colonialism and the Spanish.
And that was really one of the reasons I say before the graphic history, because the places you go, I mean, again, you know, are just so extraordinarily beautiful, and again, Liz really was up to the challenge, because so he is sort of he's part of his brother's rebellion, 1780 to 1783. So it's a bit before, it's right when the United States have consolidated. It's a bit before the French and quite a bit before the Haitian revolutions. A mass uprising in Cusco, which is in southern Peru, used to be the Inca capital. It's still a very indigenous area. And this uprising was spread into what is today Bolivia with separate uprisings, and really had the Spanish on the run. In my other book, I argue that the Spanish at one point were about to capitulate. They thought they were maybe going to give up a huge territory, and it's a sort of fascinating counterfactual. Instead, the Spanish, with quite a bit of luck, these sort of, you know, last minute wheeling and dealing and such, they won. Brutal repression in this area where the Spanish tried to reimpose power. They failed, but the repression itself was brutal. Juan Bautista had been jailed, let go, and then they decided to round up the whole family. So he and his wife, Susana Aguirre, who I've found very little information about, were, you know, rounded up, taken to jail. And then what was called in his words, his Odyssey began when they were taken down to Lima, which is Cusco is about 12,000 feet above sea level. And they hiked some of the worst Andes. He had a horse, actually. Someone gave him a horse, or probably a mule. Most of the people were chained. His mother in this trip died of dehydration, horrific conditions. And then they went along the Andes north, went down to the coast. And although they didn't have the altitude or the cold, then they had the heat, and they were ragged. So they make it to Lima. He's in jail in Lima. He gets malaria. And then the court in Lima confirms his sentence of exile to Spain, to Ceuta. Originally, they talked about a different prison in Mexico. So they're shackled on on a Peruano, this ship that's overloaded with gold and silver. These were periods of the British were blocking the Atlantics. They had the sort of Spanish waited and then sent these huge amounts. That's why there was the other ship crashed. There was a shipwreck for the other one that accompanied them. They go around in the first stage. His wife dies. He tells this terrible story. Of course, we have it in the graphic history. It's very literally graphic. His wife dies. He spends the night. He finally in the morning alerts them, and they literally just grab her body and throw her in the ocean. So the indignities have just begun. They're in Rio, beautiful place. You think Rio, you smile, but again, terrible conditions. He was locked to one of the masts for 3 to 4 months. Many of the people were dying by then, and then finally made it over to Spain, where he was confirmed to Ceuta. So it's this incredible journey across the Atlantic, and we have, because of his memoirs, very good details about some aspects of it. I was able to learn a lot about the ship because there were a couple scientific travelers who were on the same ship who describe it. What's very curious, they never mention these what we would today call political prisoners. So then he's sentenced to Ceuta, which is right across it's one of the pillars of Hercules. Hercules supposedly opened the Mediterranean by, raising up Ceuta and raising up Gibraltar. You can, from Ceuta, you can supposedly see Spain. I had to go to Ceuta to see it. It was a fascinating place. It's a very small stretch. You look on the left side, you can see what's the Atlantic. On the right side, both a stone's throw, the Mediterranean, and it's still a Spanish possession with a very colonial feel. The wiring around it, keeping out Moroccans, it's in Morocco, as any in Moroccan would say, are something that remind us of the U.S.-Mexico wall. And this is where he, he was for, I always remember, I want to say 33 years. All the other works that I'd read about him, there's quite a bit of secondary literature, not a lot. Some had always said, well, he was chained up in a dungeon for 30 years. And I discovered, no, he was actually a confinado. He was confined. He couldn't leave Ceuta, but he could move around. And this is where, so then, years in Ceuta, things begin to change in Spain. I won't go, the background here is very complicated, but Spanish liberalism takes over in Spain, and they begin to free political prisoners. In this terrible moment, the decree comes out. He's not included because he had been in so long, they had forgotten that people from those years were still prisoners. So there's sort of one horrible thing after another. Finally, this sort of bittersweet moment, as an old man, he and Duran Martel cross the ocean on the retrieve, make it to Buenos Aires. The Rivadavia government pays him to write his memoirs. And he writes these memoirs that are debated about whether they're apocryphal, they're true or not, or they're real. Writes a stirring letter to Bolivar asking to come back, but dies at about 80, in his early 80s. So he
never got back to Cusco.
He never got back to Peru. Yeah. And he's buried in an unmarked grave, and there are campaigns right now in Peru. And I think, this is gonna sound obnoxious. In my book, which will be out in Spanish soon, it might hasten this push to bring back some remains, whether forensic and whether we can find his remains, what this would mean to Peru, I think is a very important act.
Thank you. That's a great illustration of the travels. One thing that I thought was fascinating and that played into his arrival in Buenos Aires and then his writing the memoir and eventually dying in Buenos Aires was the kind of changing, let's say, coding of what it meant to be Incan or have Incan background, right? I don't think we talked about he and his half-brother's descent from, I guess, Incan rulers. Right. And that was of interest to people in Buenos Aires when he came back in a really fascinating way. So if you want to.
Yeah, it's a really curious moment in Latin American history. And there's a lot of interest in this in Argentina today, because these are still very vivid or very lively topics. Argentina is in the 18th century, let's say, relatively unpopulated. It's sort of the frontier of Eastern South America. And during the Wars of Independence, they're looking for a tradition, and they look to the Inca past. The Incas had made it to what is today very northern Argentina, Jujuy, Salta, Tucumán, areas that I know pretty well because I lived there for a while. But some of the early rebel leaders in Argentina think about, maybe we should have an Inca. We need a monarchy. So there were serious discussions about having an Inca monarchy, and there was this sort of Tupac Amaru boom. in 1816, 17, 18, 19, 20. I mean, if you're a soccer fan and you know your Argentine jersey, the sun, which is one of the things, the light blue and the white with the sun, is an Inca sun. Their constitution, the Sol, their constitution was published in Aymara and Quechua as well as Spanish. So there's this moment of looking to the past. And this shocked Juan Bautista. I mean, it would be, it's a bit like when you go somewhere and, people know Davis really well. And so then you find out they've lived here or something like this. I mean, so we include that shock in there. Right as he is writing his memoirs, there's a shift, a more conservative government comes in. And this is really an ideological battlefield in Argentina. And they just ridicule this. They say, how could we have an Indian king? Use all the racist tropes of the 19th century. He's sort of part of this. And this explains why he was given a subsidy and so well treated, because he and his brother, Tupac Amaru, is an Inca last name. They claim, and I believe justifiably, to be descendants of the Incas. That is the leaders of the Incan Empire who were defeated or pushed aside in the 16th century by the Spanish.
Great, and I want to emphasize that we welcome questions from the audience. You can put them in the Q&A function of Zoom webinar or in the chat, either one. One of the things I thought was really also interesting about the book was the really vivid depiction of the transatlantic voyages, because of course that's getting more and more attention, as it should, just how brutal they were. But here we're going in a different direction. And I think you had that log, you showed it on a slide of the number of people who died on the transatlantic trip. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that and what that sort of tells us about maritime, marine history and the history of kind of mobility within colonialism.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I really benefited from the great work on the slave trade. I mean, literally on understanding this, I was shocked when this Dombre, a very famous French botanist who, I found his memoirs and he was on the same El Peruano on the same ship. And I was so excited. I remember getting that narrow library loan and struggling with it. And he never mentions these people. So they were other class, not to be looked upon. In his memoirs, there's two things he stresses about I guess three things: the death of his family members, his mother dying of dehydration in front of him, his wife being attached. He talks about the brutality of the Spanish. There's a very anti-Spanish tone in here, probably a reflection of the wars of independence and sort of Spanish passing of the moment. But the third element is just how horrible it was to be on that ship. Just the terror of it, the sunburn, the fear of scurvy, the diseases going around. They were cold. They didn't eat enough. He was always hungry. He talks about, the mates would throw a bone and they would fight among this. He over and over talks about the brutality of that. And I frankly hadn't seen, this didn't enter my register history of this period. I just didn't think about this. We think of people, we think of a variety of people, including indigenous people of the Andes, who go to Spain to defend themselves, to fight for the Incas, these variety of sort of transatlantic indigenous intellectuals. But there's very little, it's sort of, okay, then they left Lima or maybe, Buenos Aires, and then they get to Spain, not about that part itself. So that was, to me, really eye-opening.
And are they, the people you're talking about, actual prisoners? They were brought as prisoners?
Some were prisoners and some weren't, but some were, so some traveled in better conditions. The list of prisoners, I mean, again, there's a lot of work to be done about these, because the list of prisoners, they picked up a series of political conspirators from Chile who, all deserve more work. Great.
One of the, I think you've started to talk about, is it Ceuta? Is that how it's pronounced?
Yeah.
The kind of just bizarre creation it is as a colonial, conjuring, basically. And I think you have a couple of panels actually on how the Moroccans tried to take it back as their territory. Yeah. And if he experienced that, if he saw those values.
He did. I mean, sometimes they put the prisoners in the front. I mean, Ceuta was this, presidio, a colonial outpost. And it was almost exactly a third prisoners, 1/3 military, and 1/3 civil society, if you will. And there was this constant hostility with what is today Morocco. It took on various, the term Barbary Coast and things like that. So the Spanish would make incursions, go in, take prisoners. There was a great fear of people going Muslim. This is something that the literature is fantastic about. Again, this is one of those, when you step out of your comfort zone, it can be so fun as an academic or as a reader, just to read something different, because this was so interesting. I hadn't known that Cervantes himself had been in this part of Africa and had been imprisoned temporarily, centuries before. So this was, I think, I can't prove this, but I assume his knowledge of Africa increased, and this is the world he lived in, and they felt that they were always attacked, that they were going to be pushed into the ocean, because Spanish power was just limited to this several of these presidios that couldn't really defend each other. So they were worried about attacks from the Mediterranean itself than from the population around them.
They must be controversial now, I would think.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's a very, I got there and it was that classic, it's a beautiful place. It's lovely. You can see Gibraltar. They are subsidized like a lot of, colonial places. So it's a little bit cheaper for some Spaniards, and it's a lovely, great tapas and food. But when I did a one-day trip into Morocco, and it, again, I'll bring back to US, Mexico. Well, I mean, there's barbed wire. There are, in Ceuta, you realize there's a huge amount of people coming from Morocco as day servants and things like that. So it has a very colonial feel. It's very controversial. If I were presenting this book in Spain and we followed this, I would have people saying, you're wrong, this is Spain, it's our territory, it's not theirs. And others would say, no, this should be given back to Morocco. So it's a very, very controversial piece of land, and you feel this there today. I mean, the incredible tranquility on the one hand, but you can feel that there are still great political tensions, and there are patrols about people who are trying to get into Ceuta, refugees, and being controlled, and you feel all of this.
Fascinating. And I think it's great to have this history to it, to see it through this historical lens. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about his friendship with Martel, because that's really a central part of the story. And then I think Martel has his own interesting story as like another political prisoner who ended up far from home.
Another element that I had been knowing about, and I think I hope the book in Spanish will really awaken more interest in him, because he's very well known in Peru. There's very little work on him. He was a Augustinian priest born in the Andes north of Cusco in a beautiful area called Huánuco, a little bit lower than Cusco. He was involved with a quite large uprising in 1812, just when Spanish America's fighting. This is the period of Hidalgo and Morelos in Mexico and such. And Duran Martel, like a lot of priests, gets involved in the patriot side. They join both sides. And in fact, we have letters of him, come with your guns, we're going to kill these terrible Spaniards. The rebellion, it's a coalition of indigenous people from the countries from the nearby area with the local sort of middle class, non-European or Creole, as the Criollo in the Spanish sense. It's defeated, and if he hadn't been a priest, he would have been executed, because they killed many soldiers, things like that, because a priest always uncomfortable. And he was sentenced to 10 years, ultimately in Ceuta. And he and Juan Bautista just have this incredibly endearing relationship. In his memoirs, there's, I have some of those passages. He just over and over, without him, I would be nothing. And then Duran Martel is granted freedom much sooner than Juan Bautista, won't leave without him. And so they stick together. Juan Bautista has a terrible, when he recrosses the Atlantic in 1821, 22, he suffers. We're not sure what it was. And, Duran Martel takes care of him, feeds him, things like kept him alive. And then, they live together in Buenos Aires. So it's a very, very endearing story. And to my disappointment, I mean, in some ways it makes for a good story, but I could only find this one document about Duran Martel. After Juan Bautista's death, he was a chaplain at a sort of public hospital in Buenos Aires, but we don't even know what. I couldn't find a death certificate or anything about them. So it was very endearing. It helps. It's important to me on one level because of the argument about where did Juan Bautista learn to write? How could he write this memoirs if he hadn't been literate before going, or not able to write well? And things like that. So it's a great story there, and I really hope to find. I mean, I want to go to Huánuco and maybe do some follow-up work, because Duran Martel deserves more.
Great. I thought one of the also wonderful things about the edition was that it has these documents at the end, and you tell the story of the kind of controversy around the memoir and issues of authorship. And I think that's also a really excellent case study for students of history, right, to experience. And if you could say about a little bit more about the historian who really kind of saved this story overall, right? Who was an
Yeah,
Argentinian. Yeah.
yeah. There's another sort of hero who a Peruvian mid 20th century. He had been a diplomat, amateur historian, writer, Francisco Loaiza, who published, I don't have him in front of me. He wrote lots and lots of books on a lot of odd topics, lots about Peru and Asia. He was one of the, perhaps believing the Chinese that arrived first in Peru, but he was a consul of Peru in Seville in the 1930s, right before the Civil War, I think 34, 35. And he and his daughter, I learned, I put wife, and this is one of those, you do some fact check, I'm so glad, Maria Amalia, they went to the Archivo de Indias with a typewriter. I learned that you could, your laptop, you took this in and they just copied documents. So he published these document collections, and he published the best edition of the memoirs in 1944, which I have. It's a really lousy edition. Every time I find one, I buy it new in Lima, a used copy, because you can find them on the streets and things like that. And he refuted this idea that Juan Bautista was an imposter. That was the word used, imposter. He was the one who led me to a lot of the documentation. I found some new stuff, but I just, hats off when you read someone who didn't have all the resources that I didn't have 80 years of scholarship on the age of revolution, on the Atlantic world, and got just about everything right. So I was really glad to be able to we got a picture of him, and we have him walking down the very famous stairs of the Archivo de Indias. So it was fun to wrap him in, and the Archivo de Indias was great. They were able to, they could find the ficha, the records of what, how long he and his daughter had been there. So it's a fun story. There's a whole sort of historiography that I have pretty lightly in there.
To the history of the memoir. What's their status today in Peru? Do you think this book will have an impact on his profile in Peru, or?
No false. I think so. I hope so. I think Peru has just finished its bicentennial in 2021. In a sense, there's a search for heroes. A lot of the heroes are white, coastal, upper class. If you some War of the Independence battles, there's a lot of. Although I think in some ways he's an anti-hero. Again, this is, I should be modest and say I don't know, but I think there will be a lot. I know there's a lot of interest in him today. He's such a curious figure. I've had when I presented about him in Peru, there's an effort. I try not to turn him into this hero, or he wasn't very important militarily in that sense, but I think there will be. I think it's a good moment for it in Peru, and the fact that they're translating it and publishing it pretty quickly is a good sign. But I hope so. But all authors think their books is going to spark a major rethinking or a renaissance. Sometimes we're right, sometimes we're wrong.
Yeah, but I guess I was just curious about the kind of status of the Tupac Amaru family and how people think about it, and if it will have.
No, there's a whole hero cult of them. This is what we do in the museum. If anyone's interested in this, we did a really lovely catalog, and it's now available free on a PDF. They're seen as these sort of counter examples of the real heroes for the indigenous movement today, for young people. They're symbols with a certain amount of superficiality, but they're important symbols of resistance, of rethinking official history, because they had been written out of official history or seen as just the beginning of what was more important battles. So there's Tupac Amaru, these are big. This is not an obscure last name at all. This is something that, if I bring up an ataxia in Lima, or in Cusco, Tupac Amaru, he was a revolutionary. Tupac Amaru was actually a liberal. He was anti-state, or it always prompts discussion.
Mm-hmm. Great. It seems like a super well chosen topic then. I was wondering, well, first let me say, are there any questions from those assembled? This will be kind of the last call, because we're going to wrap up at 6 and let Chuck have a nice evening after this excellent presentation. I have some more questions, so I'm happy to continue. One was about the kind of process of working on the comics. Like, how did you work with Liz, and did the editors give you feedback? Because I think it must be pretty far from your usual work process.
Yeah, the editors are great. I mean, one thing we changed, I should just mention this. This is a series of Oxford. I have several others, and one of the things we didn't like is in the others, all the introductions came first, and the comic was the second half. And I said, no, the key to this is the comic. The key is this artwork. This is it, and then we'll put the historical context, my like 25-page essay where I talk about all the things we've talked about today, and then I've got the primary documents. So what Liz explained to me, there's a script form, there's a, she had an Excel sheet, what page number, how many entries there are going to be, and is it the word, is it spoken or not, and just tell her what the image is going to be. So if I said they take in Peruano the ship, they get on, and I said, boom, I found in the Maritime Museum, here's a depiction of it. So I did that. One thing that I found that I'm doing the translation, and I've had it track, there's no footnotes in that process. So I'd be crazily looking, oh my God, I need a description of Cádiz, and I'd find some beautiful thing and do it. And now a year, 3 years later, 4 years later, I don't remember where I got it from. Is that, which normally, because of historians were so, footnotey, it's right there. Okay, this is the source. So yeah, it was a learning process. Liz was great. She was super patient. She would say too many texts, too many words, or she just, anything she didn't get, she would ask me about. The editors were very strong. I did the typical mistake. I assumed knowledge about the Tupac Amaru rebellion. It's like when we lecture our own field, we often, well, you all know this. We know it. The students don't know it. Whereas so much of this was new to me. It was, valuable to get it. The other thing is I shared it with a lot of people, and, they were really generous. I won't start naming people, but, I know a few Argentine historians. I said, look, I know Argentine history pretty well. I've been to Buenos Aires, but I don't know what I know what Lima looks like in 1800, but is this okay? And I had a couple things like, they had secularized the cemetery and there weren't crosses, or I had this avenue with big buildings, there weren't big buildings yet and stuff like that. That was really helpful. So, the advice is don't, colleagues were generally amazingly helpful. I mean, I wrote someone, what did a wine glass look like in Spain, 1800? I don't know. And, people who know this stuff love to share the information. So that was, I shamelessly asked people, I'd go to the library, look up, things like that, but people loved it. And I have a friend who's a retired historian who was in the Navy, and Bruce was an incredible help to me, because I that was a real challenge to me. So
the sort of types of ships. And
yeah, the ships was really hard. We were warned about, that's the one. Nobody's going to really care if your streets are a meter probably too wide, or something in Buenos Aires, or you use a type of brick that might not have existed yet. I haven't gotten anything like that. I found a couple of my own mistakes now that we're doing the translation, but they will get you on that, the ship, as I mentioned before.
Right. One of the things I was sort of surprised by, and I'm interested to hear what you say about this, is that you don't have like a strip across the page where you're reading sequentially in a series, like in the kind of more traditional comic book.
Right.
It's almost like you have almost a single big panel, but all this interesting layering that maybe invites more engagement from the reader than being guided through in a strip form.
Yeah. I haven't received criticism that the font is too small. This is maybe my aging, my family's getting old, I'm getting old, and a lot of our readers are, I had to really put in the reading glasses. It's hard to do that. That was all Liz. I will take I just got out of the way of almost any design thing, except for, a couple like colors I didn't like or stuff like that. She was really good at that. She's done 5 or 6 of these. She's a very renowned artist, in not just in a series of world. And she was just masterful at that. So, I was a little bit taken aback by, I was like, I want to know at one point I said, where do you go? Which is, well, there's a natural movement. We read left to right, and, from up to down, but it's okay if people jump around a little bit and linger. So
right, and one of the things that's layered really nicely into a lot of the pages are the maps, I thought. And because you have a different sort of sourcing for the maps, sometimes different types of maps worked in, and it's quite subtle, but also I think very helpful to see where these things are.
Right. Well, I'm just everything I read should have more maps. I mean, I read, I don't know why when I read, when I read about Ukraine in the New Yorker, throw in a map. We don't all know where everything is. And I always tell my students in classes, to not sound obnoxious, I can't place every country in the world on a map. So I'm going to make you learn in my upper division class in Latin American history. We're doing a map quiz. You should know which one's Guatemala. You should know which one's Brazil, but you have time to learn this and things like that. So I really liked, that was, I'll say, my idea. And they were, yeah, please do this, because this is part of the assumed knowledge, and same with Spain, where is Cádiz and things like that.
Right. No, I think it works super well because you convey tons of information, orient the reader, but without it being so intrusive. And it is also just part of the beauty of the panels. So I think job well done there. So I guess maybe a last question. What are you working on now? We'd love to know. I guess the Spanish translation is about to come out. Congratulations on that.
I have a very different project. I'm working on violence in the Shining Path in Peru. This is the Maoist guerrilla movement that spread and was very powerful in Peru from 1980 to 2000. I've been working on this project for quite a bit, really since I started it right when I was in the midst of this. So I was doing both of them. It's a history of violence, why young people joined this movement. So it's a whole different, I mean, it's even more of a change than this, frankly, because I'm doing oral history. A lot of people are alive. People who are alive who are involved. It's definitely out of my comfort zone of Peru 1750 to 1850, which what's that, 4 or 5 books by now. So I'm working on that, and I'm COVID really set me back for final interviews and things like that. But I was just back in March and going back this summer, and I'm actually writing. I'm onto my 2nd chapter soon, so I'm getting there.
Well, fantastic. Well, congratulations again on this book. That sounds like a wonderful project. Maybe we'll have you back for that. And thanks for coming by today. Thanks everybody for coming, and good luck. Have a good end of the quarter.
Thank you, and thanks.
Thanks, Chuck. Yep.